and that this divine principle, variously named and defined, was the principal deity in all these pantheons. We observe men like the Emperor Julian contemplating this very thoughtfully and strengthening our belief that such could have been the case when he gave us his two great orations, one to the sovereign Son and the other to the Mother of the Gods. He tells us beyond doubt that his own contemplations have shown him the universality of a divine principle. Consequently, it is not necessary that this should have been imposed upon men, either by Christianity or by Hermeticism. Already philosophy had acknowledged it, but in the old days, when nations were separate and the commerce between them was very slight, peoples of various nations did not know the beliefs of their brothers and their neighbors. Gradually, as this knowledge improved, we became more aware of these things, the public mind itself inevitably produced this concept of the over-deity. The deity that did not destroy the other gods, nor was this deity merely one becoming victorious and gaining special veneration. It was a new dimension of deity, a permeating, penetrating, universal power, a power in which all things shared, and which was the common life of all living. Thus, it would be inevitable that if this concept arose in the minds of progressive thinkers, that it would be the natural substance for the integration of sect or creed or cult or faith. It is also quite possible, as always is the case, that early rising of such belief would be secret. That men would gather first to mature their own ideas and to escape the eternal stigma of unorthodoxy which has followed thinkers since the beginning of time. Thus these precious discoveries, following in the pattern and practice of the older mysteries, would be communicated only to an elect, only to those who were regarded as capable of understanding correctly this new dimension of things. Which brings us to the next point in connection with the Hermetic philosophy, and that is its relationship to the mystery systems of the world at that time. We have mentioned the state religions. We must always remember that behind each state religion was some kind of a mystical or metaphysical structure. Antiquity did not know of a religion without mysteries. And by mysteries now we do not mean secrets in the general sense of the word, but structures, ethical, moral, spiritual institutions, sacred colleges or schools. And they were called mysteries because they were sealed or closed from the profane, even as though they had been closed by some kind of an hermetic stopple. These mysteries always had a deeper dimension than the general opinions of the people. As far back as the 6th century, when Pythagoras traveled throughout the Near East and the southern parts of Europe and finally into Far Asia, he came back fully convinced that in their esoteric schools all the great religions of the world were already teaching the same thing. The average person hadn't discovered this, however. Perhaps we can suspect that the confusion resulting in the collapse of the outer structure of religion of many of these peoples threw a great and sudden weight upon the esoteric schools. And these esoteric schools were not essentially theological as we know it today, and therefore they were not quite as vulnerable as the so-called popular religions. These so-called esoteric schools were actually institutions of higher learning. And even though you might lose faith in your deities, you could not deny the multiplication table. You could not deny the value of herbs and medicines in healing. You could not deny the secrets of bone setting. You could not deny the motion of the heavenly bodies, nor the secrets of navigation. You could no longer perhaps accept certain beliefs, but you were still leaning heavily upon jurisprudence, which was originally taught in these temples. You were leaning very heavily upon the laws and canons of art, of sculpture, and of music. All the great scientific knowledge, which was originally dedicated to the gods, and was disseminated through the schools of these gods, this knowledge did not die with the popular faith. Thus, the esoteric schools, all the mysteries, perhaps came forward more rapidly after the decline of the state religions. Men now had a new level of value upon which to pin their faith. And it is quite possible that it was at this time that the gradual shift from a spiritual to a scientific way of life actually began. And as it took thousands of years to create the philosophical religious systems of the ancients, the last 2,000 years has been largely dedicated to the shift from the theological foundation of exoteric religion to the great mystery sciences of esoteric religion. In any event, the learned, the leading minds, those who became the opinion makers of their own days, certainly must have recognized that you could not destroy the school with the temple, that the school had to go on, that man still had to learn. The increasing dignity of the school is expressed in Neoplatonism, Gnosticism, and Hermetic philosophy, and to a degree in the Essene and Therapeutae doctrine, certainly in the Kabbalism of the early Jewish mystics, rising from Rabbi Akiva, who belongs to this same critical period and is just about as difficult to orient as any of the others. All of this seems to show that the universe began to emerge as a great wonder of law. We no longer hear of the gods walking around the earth concealed as mortals, or riding away into heaven in chariots. We no longer see winged immortals flying in space. We hear no more of nymphs and hamadryads. These things vanish. Instead of that, we begin to hear of the teachers, the great illuminators, those who came with extraordinary knowledge, those who made possible the advancement of arts and sciences, and those who gradually transformed the beliefs of men into a kind of moral philosophy or ethical system, a system based almost entirely upon the philosophic premise of adjustment to disillusionment. Philosophy is actually man's reconciliation with the inevitable. And in that we see it emerging. We see it coming more and more into the foreground. And we find men like Hermes, or beings like Hermes, no longer simply telling stories and fables about the gods, or writing hymns about deities, or perpetuating the powers of arbitrary deities. We find Hermes and these others beginning to talk about structure, about the universal law of living. And we know that out of the North African Hermetic tradition, almost certainly the astronomical theory of Ptolemy came into existence. The theory that controlled the thinking of men until the day of the Copernican rediscovery of the old heliocentric idea. We find law, lawfulness, education, culture coming forward very rapidly, apparently from nowhere, and spearheaded by mysterious, phantom-like persons. Let's pause for a moment and consider for the Neoplatonism, which was in the same general area. It is now generally believed that Neoplatonism was founded by a man called Ammonius Saccas. Ammonius Saccas was a sort of North African Aesop. He was a strange man of no education as far as is known, and his name implies his trade. He was a carrier of bundles, burdens, and trunks. He was Ammonius of the sack, and he delivered goods for people and received a small amount of money for transporting and transferring freight and baggage. He was sometimes referred to as a porter, certainly as a carrier of burdens. This man is supposed to have suddenly burst out with one of the most transcendent systems of mysticism the world has ever known. How he received it, where it came from, no one has been able to say. Yet this man, unlettered, unschooled, unlearned, drew around himself one of the most brilliant academy of thinkers the world has ever known, including such minds as Plotinus, Iamblichus, and other leading thinkers of his day, finally to produce in Athens a little later the glorious, glittering figure of Proclus, who is called or surnamed the Platonic successor. The rise of Neoplatonism is a mystery, and has always remained a mystery. Yet there is a dark hint that behind Ammonius Saccas was another person, that for some reason this other person chose to be represented by the common bearer of burdens. Now, who is this bearer of burdens? Perhaps it is the same bearer of which there is reference in the Bible, of cast your burdens upon the Lord. Also, there are many concepts of Jesus as bearing the burden of the world's woe, or bearing the burden of mortal sin. This burden bearer keeps appearing in many localities, certainly a possible symbolic statement or concept. But who and what was the force behind this? It is quite possible that these persons simply represented teachers or initiated masters sent out of the schools or out of the mystery system, or stepping in because of their superior knowledge into the vacuum left by the collapse of popular theology and moving the entire concept onto a new level. It could well be that under such a situation, this breaking through could have occurred in many places at almost the same time, because the need was general. And the need in this case produced an almost perfectly structured breakthrough in a dozen places simultaneously. We may assume that these were inspirational, but we may also assume that the temples were the source of the inspiration, for they had been for a very long time. Furthermore, as soon as this breakthrough occurred, as soon as the world in general began to think scientifically, philosophically, cosmologically, and to begin to use the instrument of symbolism with a certain intuitive apperception, the moment this breakthrough took place, the mystery schools vanished. And from that time in the Western world we heard no